Deirdre Hennebury, and I'm a faculty member here in the College of Architecture and Design. And on behalf of the college and also the Albert Kahn Research Coalition, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's lecture. And I'm going to leave most of the story of Wirt Rowland's work to our guest speaker, Michael G. Smith, but just that he's an individual that many of us, even in the architectural community, don't know much about. And his new book, Michael's new book, we know, sheds a lot of light on his contributions to Detroit architecture, but also architecture in other parts of the state, specifically Saginaw. Michael G. Smith, our guest this evening, is the author of a newly released book, Designing Detroit, Wirt Rowland and the Rise of Modern American Architecture. And this book actually was recently won a state award, the 2017 State History Award. So congratulations, Michael.
Thank you.
He's a Detroit-based architectural historian with an interest in early 20th century architecture and construction. His lifelong enthusiasm for the fine arts led to an early career as a graphic artist and more recently as a photographer. And Michael's photography work has been published internationally. So please join me in welcoming Michael G. Smith.
Can you hear me? Okay. Should I use this or not? Don't need it. Okay. All right. I'm glad you all could make it here today. I'm glad I could make it here today. And I'm going to ask a question just to find out how many people in this room, aside from this particular get-together, have ever heard of Wirt Rowland? Not very many. Okay. How many people know what building this is? Really? Some of you don't know what building this is in Detroit. All right. Well, we're gonna get to all that. My chief interest here is in telling you a little bit about Wirt Rowland, but also explaining how Rowland was able to develop a systematic method for design. And when I say design, I mean graphic arts, architecture, art, just about any kind of design-oriented field is based on a number of underlying principles and methods that universalize the particular form of art. And Rowland, I think, is, of all the Art Deco architects, is probably the most advanced in terms of his development of a system. And we're gonna, first turn this on, I was told. Yes. Might you know how to do that? Should I whisper too? Brilliant. Okay, thank you. All right, now we're going to get this thing really hopping. Maybe. Yeah. Okay, I think that you have to be aware of this. I'm not sure why, but it's very good for you. The learning objectives. Just so you know, everything you hear and see is going to be on the test, in case you were wondering. I would direct your attention in particular to the 5th learning objective. Moving right along. To give you a sense of Rowland's impact on the state of Michigan alone, by 1930, the 4 largest cities in the state, Wirt Rowland had designed the 4 tallest buildings in each of those cities. And as it so happens, 2 of those buildings are still the tallest buildings in those cities, in Saginaw and in Flint. Rowland was born in Clinton, which if you're headed out to Ann Arbor and forget to stop, you'll get to Clinton. It's about 50 miles outside of Detroit. Wirt first worked for a fellow by the name of George D. Mason. Has anybody in here ever hear of George Mason? Okay. Mason, among many other things, designed the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island. Word came to work for him in 1902, and by 1905, Mason had been hired to design 2 reinforced concrete hotels in Detroit. And at the time, they were the 2 largest construction projects that had ever been engaged in the city of Detroit. And Rowland was given responsibility for the design of these buildings and for creating the architectural drawings. Then he left Mason's employment and went to work for Albert Kahn. Has anybody in here heard of Albert Kahn? Okay, we're getting somewhere. These are a couple buildings that Rowland designed. This building right here, the Dollar Savings and Trust building, is actually in Wheeling, West Virginia, and was not particularly notable except for the fact that it was written up in a couple of architectural magazines as being a particularly well-designed building. Now, if you were to have gone to the U of M architecture school, you'd be familiar with this building, but you wouldn't be here today, probably. So this is Hill Auditorium at the University of Michigan, and very beautifully designed building. Interesting because the university didn't have the kind of money that most of the Eastern schools had to create this massive marble-encrusted structure that looked like it was a Roman bath. Instead, what Rowland designed was a building that had classical references, but also prairie-style references, and was exceptionally unique in terms of the design of the building, both on the exterior and on the interior. He left Kahn's office and went to work for Malcolmson and Higginbotham. That was the firm that at the time designed all of Detroit's schools. And not only was the city having to design new schools because of tremendous growth of the city and city's population, but they were converting all of their older schools, which were not fireproof, to steel reinforced concrete buildings, which were much safer. Of the 3 high schools that Rowland designed, 2 of them still stand, and these are those 2. Very notable building, the Detroit News Building, was widely hailed at the time of its completion for 2 reasons. One, it was the first building to be designed specifically for the purpose and the sole purpose of a large urban newspaper. But it was also very notable because of its, maybe not to us today, but at the time, a very modern design, which was primarily Romanesque in terms of its features, but very plain, had very little ornamentation other than the sculpture that was included on the building. The Hatcher Library at U of M, this particular building is interesting because of this very large reading room, which Rowland designed in such a way that it would be very quiet. It's essentially a square cross-section with the top of it being an arched shape, which tends to deaden the sound, and continues to be a very popular place for studying to this day because it's very quiet and it can house a lot of people who are serious about their studies. The very first Air Force base in the country was actually Selfridge Field, which is now Selfridge Air Base, and it was designed by Albert Kahn under the auspices of the U.S. Army Air Corps. When war was declared with Germany, the U.S. had something like 50 pilots and 35 aircraft. It was really, for all intents and purposes, not an Air Force at all. And so they conducted a massive operation to build both permanent and temporary training fields, and Selfridge was the very first of those training fields. The plans for the field were put together in about 10 days, and all of the buildings were constructed using wood and hardware that you could find at the local lumber yard or hardware store. It was an incredible accomplishment. They were able to construct an entire Air Force base in a little under 2 months, and much of it was due to the very clever design skills employed by Kahn's staff, particularly Rowland. The permanent buildings that were built at Langley and at the San Diego Air Force Base, which is now, I think, Coronado Naval Air Center, were particularly well designed by Rowland, really attractive buildings that look very similar to the school buildings he designed. But these buildings remain in use today, interestingly enough. This is now the headquarters for the U.S. Air Combat Command. So you can see that Rowland, although most of his buildings are found in Michigan, his buildings are also found on both U.S. coasts and constitute the first permanent structures that were built for the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Corps. After the war ended, Kahn's office got back to work designing some fairly significant buildings. The General Motors building, of course, I'm sure all of you are familiar with that. You may not be aware of the fact, though, that even though the building is credited as an Albert Kahn designed building, it was actually not designed by Albert Kahn. The building was designed by Wirt Rowland, as were all of Kahn's buildings at the time, because Rowland was Kahn's lead designer, and it was actually the designer in the architecture firm that was responsible for the layout of the building, the exterior appearance, the size of the offices, essentially everything, which is something I assume that as architecture students you'd be familiar with. And can I assume that most of you are in here because you're architecture students? Architecture students, raise your hand. Okay. So if I say to you that the lead designer or the chief designer is responsible for the design of the building, is that something that you've been taught or that you know about, or have things changed in the last 100 years? Yes? No? No. It hasn't changed, or it has? No, okay. Rowland finished his work at Kahn and left there in 1922 to join Smith, Hinchman & Grills. The reason that he did that is because Kahn was very much a traditionalist, or had become so by the time 1920s rolled around. And he'd sort of gotten disenchanted with the modern style that had been employed on the Detroit News building. And this is a problem for Rowland, because Rowland was very much a modernist and wanted to design buildings that were new in terms of their appearance, buildings that weren't decorated with Roman or Greek columns or other features that were borrowed from old buildings, particularly for skyscrapers, because when you borrow an ornament from a building that was built thousands of years ago, or even hundreds of years ago, it's a building that doesn't go up hundreds and hundreds of feet into the sky. And Rowland felt, as many architects of the time did, that an entirely new decorative method needed to be devised for skyscrapers. So Rowland clashed with Kahn on this particular issue, and it was resolved by Rowland leaving and going to work for Smith, Hinchman & Grills. They made Rowland an offer at the time that the Buell Company came to Smith, Hinchman & Grills with the idea of building a new office building, and the Buell building is what the result was. The interesting considerations for the Buell building, because of the nature of the lot, a typical building that might be U-shaped with a courtyard in the back would not have given the same type of light and ventilation through the windows as would be most desirable. So Rowland took the basic design from the General Motors building and applied it to the Buell building. What you have essentially is a Latin cross shaped building where all of the offices faced to the outside. So no offices suffered the indignity of having the limited light and limited ventilation that came from having an office that was on a small courtyard. And that was a significant achievement with this particular building. Now, in terms of the style of the design of the building, Rowland sought to develop a style of architecture that, although it had its roots in the old world and recognized the old world, was essentially American in nature, something that would be clear to the observer that this building was designed by an American architectural firm and designed to be appreciated by Americans. And what you have here is, right here, is a typical symbol used by the American Southwestern Pueblo and Plains Indians. We would call it today a swastika, but at the time, before it had the unfortunate connotation that it got during the Hitler period, it was simply seen as a very interesting symbol that many people wore in the form of jewelry, for example, to participate in some way with the American character of the Native American Indians. However, at the same time, you have features like this, which are very European in origin. So Rowland mixed the symbols together and came up with a design that really celebrated not just the European roots of architecture, but the new architectural feature of Native Americans being displayed on a skyscraper, which is a type of building that the Europeans were not at that time actually building. One of his coolest buildings, I think, is the Bankers Trust Company building, which is, again, downtown Detroit. It's an incredibly interesting building. It's ornate in a certain way, but also very, very restrained. It's certain elements of Romanesque architecture, as well as Renaissance architecture, but done in such a way that the building is very, very well designed for the use that it was put to as a bank building. There's a great deal of natural sunlight that came in through the windows. And because the building faces away from the sun, it very seldom gets direct sunlight on it. I actually went to the trouble of photographing the building at a time when it was late afternoon in the summer, and there's a little bit of sun on the right side of the building. But most of the time it was in shadow. So Rowland designed the building with a great deal of surface texture so that the building would show off well even during most of the day when there was no sun on it. Now here again, Rowland has employed a number of symbols. This is actually an eagle with the two stars. You might not be aware of this, but back at that time, it was more common to have in your pocket a silver dollar. Well, most silver dollars had this symbol on it, the eagle, and oftentimes with 1, 2, or 3 stars. So there's a symbol for the United States of America. Right here, you have, again, the swastika in the form of these whirling leaves, because the swastika symbol is sometimes referred to as whirling wind, or is a Navajo symbol. It was whirling wind was often the way it was described, other than a swastika. But then here you have all these very detailed and very carefully copied Romanesque ornaments that have been placed on the building. So a combination of really many different periods of both architecture and modern American style that have been combined effectively by Rowland and used in a way that advances the symbology. Now we're going to get to Rowland's modern buildings. First of all, the Greater Penobscot building. This is a building that was for many years the tallest building in the state of Michigan until the Renaissance Center was built. At the time, as I mentioned, there was kind of a fascination with the American Southwest, and one of the major items that people had an interest in were the Pueblos of New Mexico, Taos Pueblo being most significant among them. In the early 20s, the architecture firm of Trost and Trost designed this hotel in Albuquerque, and it was a tremendously successful design. This building, this actual photograph was seen in many different architectural journals and many different popular journals. The hotel itself became one of the most popular destinations for conventions and for tourism as people went to explore the Southwest. And Trost did a phenomenal job here of incorporating the feeling and the concept of the Pueblos, which were very cubist and bare in appearance, into a very modern looking building that isn't a copy of the Pueblos, but evokes that sort of sense or feeling. And interestingly enough, if you look at, this is the Franciscan Hotel, and then this is the Masonic Temple, both right next to each other in Albuquerque, and both designed by the same architect. So you can see how rapidly the styles were changing in the Southwest. It was changing just as rapidly in the Midwest, but not in the same way. It wasn't, you didn't see Pueblo revival structures in the Midwest. However, Rowland picked up on that, and being an individual who was fascinated with both architectural developments and with the Native American culture of the Southwest, Rowland took the Franciscan Hotel as an inspiration for the Penobscot building. And that's why the Penobscot building, at the time it was built, was considered extremely modern because of its lack of exterior ornamentation. But you can see what Rowland was going for here in terms of a cubist appearance that, again, took one step beyond the Franciscan towards a celebration of American architecture in the form of the Pueblos, which many architects at the time considered the Pueblos to be the only Native American architecture, the only architecture in the US that didn't come from Europe. Now, there's another interesting thing about the Penobscot building. Of course, there's no way to confirm this, but the setbacks on the building, which were actually arrived at by Rowland in a different way, which I'll show you momentarily, also line up very well with Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. Well, make of it what you will, but it is a very good fit. And the idea for comparing this came to me when I was looking at the building one day, and I had this odd sensation that the building was looking at me too. And that's when I remembered the Vitruvian Man sketch and thought, I wonder if there's something about the proportions of the building that make it very similar to the proportions of a human being. And regardless of whether it's a good fit with the sketch, the proportions of the building are very, very much similar to human proportions. It's something that maybe somebody can explore further. Now, going on to the Guardian building, this is really Rowland's greatest achievement and recognized as such throughout the world. If you look at what people have written in other places besides Michigan, the Guardian building is often referred to as the greatest Art Deco structure ever conceived. In Detroit, I think we tend to underestimate the things that are so close to us, because if it's nearby, it must not be great. But this building actually is probably one of the most phenomenal building designs ever created. At least I think so. And if you haven't seen the building, it's absolutely essential that you do so before you skip out of town or go on to other things. Now, these are the four innovations that Rowland came up with in designing this building. These are things that, except for perhaps the penthouse, nobody else had ever done before. Not the Greeks, not the middle-aged architects, and not the Art Deco designers either. These are all unique contributions that came from Rowland. First of all, the incredible use of color in the design of the building. The use of the angled arches, which I'll explain a little bit further in a minute. The use of stainless steel. I'm sure everybody is familiar with the rapid adoption of stainless steel as a hardware element for buildings beginning in the late 1920s. That all comes from the Guardian building. It started with the Guardian building, and after that it was considered very old school to use brass or bronze. And finally, Rowland's use of the prominent penthouse on the building to designate where the front of the building is, which if this wasn't done, the building would have ended up a big slab. It would have looked something like the United Nations building and been quite uninteresting. But Rowland was in a situation where, as you know, you have to have a water tower and you have to have elevator equipment in a penthouse on the top of the building. Instead of seeing that as a problem to be overcome, Rowland took that as a solution to how to give a very distinctive appearance to the north end of the building. In fact, he added 3 floors here just to push that penthouse up a little higher and make the tower a little more interesting. Now, going back to the Buell building for just a moment, you can see how Rowland used a lattice of lines, and I can't take the time to explain how he arrived at that right now. It's explained more thoroughly in my book. But the point is that if you look at this lattice, all of the distinctive elements on the front of the building all line up with the intersection points of this lattice. And then suddenly one day, Rowland had the brilliant idea of eliminating the ornaments and simply expressing the lattice as a colored design. And that's the basic idea which underlines the Guardian building and why he used color and why he used very little ornamentation other than that. Now, the specific manner in which Rowland came up with the design elements for the Guardian building and most of his succeeding buildings is through something called dynamic symmetry. Is there anybody in here that's ever heard of dynamic symmetry? One person. All right. There was a time when dynamic symmetry was all the rage, back in the 20s. I'm going to explain it very quickly here, just so you understand that there is something to it rather than it being a random type of thing. You take a square and you take the diagonal to the square. If the square is 1 unit high, the diagonal to the square is going to be the square root of 2. If you rotate that diagonal down so that it forms the second side of a rectangle, you have what's called a root 2 rectangle. And the side, which is 1, and the other side, which is the square root of 2, are incommensurable. You cannot divide one into the other and end up with a rational number. If you take a square and a root 2 rectangle, you join them together, then you take a second one and offset it so that they touch at the corners, you begin to get a solid figure. If you take 4 of those figures, you end up with this figure right here, which is an 8-sided figure, which can also be described as 2 squares, 1 square rotated vis-a-vis the second square. And you'll see where that's going to become an important consideration. Rowland used this figure throughout the design of the Guardian building. And here you can see it in its very simplest form. You're looking down on it from above. This is the north tower, and you can see how this figure right here is the exact same as this figure right here, which is a dynamically symmetrical design figure. Shows up on the Guardian building and many other of Rowland's buildings. Here you see the same figure, and you can see how it's used to describe the entire design of the lobby of the Guardian building. Now, if you haven't been in the building, then you'll have to take my word for it that that's what this is. This is the lobby of the Guardian building. But you can see with just this very crude illustration that this is what defines the entire space. Here is a drawing that I've made that just shows the basic elements and why they are dynamically symmetrical, because everything in here is either a square or a root 2 rectangle. Here's your square, here's your root 2 rectangle. Every other space in here can be defined by those figures. And that's the way Rowland proceeded to design the lobby. This is just the figure that I've drawn, superimposed over the original architectural drawing for the lobby of the Guardian building, just to show you that I'm not making this up. Now, we're going to take the same figure and go one step further with a different part of the building. And you're not going to be able to look at this here and get the gist of it. I'm just putting it up here so you know that the proof exists. But this is the key element right here, and I'll show that to you here. This is the north end of the Guardian building, and my point here is just to simply describe the way in which Rowland used this dynamically symmetrical figure of squares and root 2 rectangles to design this entire space, including the balcony right here. That's what defines the width of the window, and it defines the furthest extent of the wall right here. Now we're going to go from root 2 rectangle to a root 3 rectangle. It's formed in the same way that you got from a square to a root 2. You get to a root 3. That becomes important here, because once Rowland designed the space, then he needed a complementary figure to design the muntins for the window, and that's where this shape comes from. It's the same root 3 rectangle shape, and then he's taken a smaller root 3 rectangle and inserted it, and then that leaves you with this shape right here, which is there. Again, it's a dynamically symmetrical figure. Throughout the building, if you walk through it, you'll find all kinds of instances where if there's a shape, it's going to be that shape. It's a octagonal shape defined by a root 3 rectangle. Now the ceiling is most fascinating for its use of color, but you can see that there's a pattern there. This is what the pattern is. Again, it's the root 3 rectangle imposed on a design problem, and the solution to the design problem is just fitting colors into the pattern that's created by the dynamically symmetrical figure. My point here is nothing in this building is the way it is because somebody eyeballed it. Everything is where it is, and the shape it is, and the color it is, because it was the result of a very scientific, geometric design effort, and there's an underlying principle involved in every one of these cases. Now, again, this is way too complicated to do just very briefly, but I put this up here just to demonstrate that the Penobscot building is also derived in the same exact way. And in this case, we're not looking at a decoration on a wall or the composition of the end of a room, but the entire building itself is designed based on a root 2 rectangle and squares. So the entire elevation of the Greater Penobscot building is dynamically symmetrical. Again, this is something that if you're interested in getting into it further, you can get in touch with me. You can look in the book, or I can send you a copy of this sketch just so you can get an idea of how to puzzle it out. All right, now, one thing that in architecture class, I suspected you probably heard somebody refer to this concept of relations being imposed on the whole, by the whole on the parts. That the parts don't define the whole, that the whole defines the parts. And this is a specific instance where Rowland has done that by using the dynamically symmetrical figure to define where each and every part is going to be, what its shape is going to be, and what its dimensions are going to be. And here's a real-life example. In Detroit, on the far east side, just before you get into Grosse Pointe, is the Michigan Bell Niagara Central Office Building. You see a photograph of the arch over the window on the right, and on the left here is exactly how Rowland came to design that specific feature. And all it is this √3 figure with the intersection lines extended out, and even the lines here, which define the joints between the limestone facing, are part of the dynamically symmetrical figure. And a final little piece of architectural design, which everybody in this room has seen, and it occurs in every single city in the country. That Rowland designed the Bell system manhole covers, and you can see the relationship here between this and the Guardian building, and you can see the √3 rectangle figure designed right into it. So every time you go out walking now, either in the street or on the sidewalk, you're likely to see one of these manhole covers. You'll know where that came from. Now, we're going to look at a few buildings quickly that define what's now called the Art Deco period of design. The Union Industrial Bank building, designed by Rowland in 1928. It's a monochromatic version, really, of the Guardian building. And his fascination with stainless steel continued here, although he discontinued using Monel metal and used Nyrosta steel instead, because it had become available and was less expensive. On all the exterior windows, he used aluminum, because aluminum did not rust and did not require painting. Now, one of the people that was on the building committee for the Union Industrial Bank building was a fellow by the name of Walter P. Chrysler, who at the time was the head of Chrysler Corporation. Chrysler lived in Flint, and he was very active on the board of the Flint Bank, and was on the building committee, and would have worked directly with Rowland in approving the design of the building. Building's design was completed in 1928. Later that year, Chrysler purchased what was called the Reynolds Building. It was simply a design for a building and a piece of land that had run out of money, and Chrysler purchased that whole package in order to build a building that he could turn over to his children to run as a business. As soon as Chrysler purchased the building, he went to architect William Van Allen and told Van Allen to get rid of the brass and the bronze that Van Allen specified for the building. In fact, there was an observation tower which was entirely encased in bronze. That whole plan was dispensed with by Chrysler, and instead he insisted that Van Allen specify stainless steel for the building as well as aluminum. The first Chrysler design had an arched entryway. The final design in the building, as you see it today, had an angled arch, much like the Guardian building. Here you see the Chrysler building as it looks today on the right, and the Michigan Bell Warehouse, which was designed by Rowland in 1928, and is the large building with the tower that you see just to the right of the Lodge Freeway as you're going north. You can see the similarities between the two. You see the figure, the 8-sided figure right in here in both, the angled arch design, and it would be my contention that this is something that was probably sketched out by Rowland for Chrysler and then included in the Chrysler building. Then there were many copycats after that. You probably heard of John Mead Howells. In a book that had photographs of the Guardian building was also found this sketch for a building that Howells designed in New York City, which, interestingly enough, used dark blue granite and Monel metal, and clearly the 8-sided designs that Rowland had invented. In Winchester, Massachusetts, an acquaintance of Rowland's, Robert Coit, designed a building that not only had the 8-sided design, but it had the arched ceiling and recessed lights, just like the lower banking lobby of the Guardian building. In Miami Beach, John and Coulton Skinner, two very prominent architects in Miami, who actually studied under Rowland in Albert Kahn's office. So they brought Rowland's design features into their structures as well. The Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio was originally designed in a very traditional manner. They hired Paul Krett, who designed in 1927, completed the DIA in Detroit, Detroit Institute of Arts. He suggested that they adopt the method that Rowland adopted for the banking lobby of the Guardian building and simply paint the ceiling of the Union Terminal, and made it a much more modern design as a result. Again, back to Miami, Roy France designed the well-known Cavalier Hotel in 1936. He was an architect, moved to Miami from Chicago. You see the similarities with Rowland's Detroit Saturday Night building, which is on East Jefferson. Probably no coincidence, because Roy France was an active member of the Architecture Society in Miami, and Rowland often vacationed down there. The two men probably knew each other. Jackson, Mississippi, the Standard Life building, clearly a very, very close copy of the Guardian building, but just about half the size. Oklahoma City, Weary and Alford, architecture firm in Chicago. Here again you see Rowland's 8-sided design. Weary and Alford lost a number of design competitions to Smith, Hinchman and Grills. Clearly they decided to join them rather than beat them. And then even in Havana, Cuba, you see again Rowland's design, 8-sided design appearing there as well. And finally in Los Angeles, the very well-known Art Deco building, the Eastern Columbia building by Claude Bielman. It would have been outrageous to design a building that was bright blue before the Guardian building came onto the scene. Architectural Digest in 2016, they listed the 5 most significant Art Deco buildings in the US. These are those buildings. Now, clearly the Guardian building, Rowland design, the Chrysler building, which owes much of its Art Deco appearance to Rowland's designs, the Eastern Columbia building, the bright blue terracotta exterior is a feature that derived from the Guardian building. The Levesque Tower, you might think, isn't in the same Rowland category, but as it turns out, the Levesque Tower was designed by C. Howard Crane, who designed the Fox Theater, was a Detroit architect and a an acquaintance of Rowland's, and probably had Rowland's help in designing the building, because Howard Crane was really only a theater designer, and that's how he got the assignment, because the Levesque Tower has a large theater in it. And the Delano Hotel actually shouldn't be in this group, in my opinion, because it wasn't built until 1939, but by then Rowland's influence was clearly apparent in Miami. Rowland died in 1946. He was almost 68 years old, and he had a fascinating career that also included serving as a director for the student architecture club at the recently founded Lawrence Tech Architectural School, which I believe was started in 1932. Rowland was a good friend of Earl Pellerin, who started the school. Pellerin was a graduate of U of M's architecture school. Pellerin knew Rowland from when they both worked in the same building. Pellerin at the time was a budding architecture student who worked summers for Albert Kahn. Rowland's office was in the same building when he worked for Smith, Hinchman and Grills. And then Rowland was very active with the architecture club. And in fact, the original architecture club for the students at LTU was called the Cliff Dwellers Club, which is hearkening back to the Cliff Dwellers, who were the Pueblo Indians. And later the name was changed, and the Student Architecture Club became an affiliate of AIA. But Rowland was a key figure in the early years of the architecture school. So I'll answer any questions you might have, as I've been requested to do by those in the officialdom. And while we do that, you can take a look. These are some of the buildings that Rowland designed that you may recognize from around the area. Yes, ma'am. Well, thank you. Yes, it is. And in fact, you can go in there anytime you want, provided that the building is open. And I think it's open all days except for Sunday. It might be closed. And you can wander around in the most exciting parts of the building. The main lobby and the banking lobby are all open to the public. If you get one of the security guards to do so, they'll take you down in the basement, and you can see there's a number of things that are of interest there. And on Saturdays and Sundays, there are free tours of the building that are led by well-informed guides. There's no charge for that. You just go in and sign up in pure Detroit, and they'll take you up to the 32nd floor and show you some other things that you might not normally get to see. It's well worthwhile. Yes, sir?
I've taken out-of-town guests at 2 in the morning, so they're open 24/7.
It's a terrific tour and very worthwhile. Yes, sir?
Are any of Rowland's buildings demolished?
Yes, unfortunately, the school number of schools that he designed were demolished. Most sadly, the school that utilized a lot of the same terracotta, colorful designs that made the school interesting. And the name of the school is, I'm forgetting right now, but Mackenzie, that's it. Very good, thank you. So that you can't see, but all of his important contributions to us are still visible and visitable. I'm a little worried about the Saturday night building, because the people that own it have sort of started and stopped in their process of rehabbing it. And right now, some of the windows are broken out, and it sort of is an invitation to scrappers to go in and scrap it. So I don't know what's going to happen there. But everything else is in good shape and well cared for. Yes, sir?
What relationship do you think Rowland had with Ernest Willoughby? As Ernest Willoughby was
Right. Well, if you go to the actual plans, you won't find Wilby's initials on them. And Wilby does not claim any credit for those buildings in his AIA applications. And I can also tell you for sure that Wilby was not working for Kahn past 1916, even though his name was still on the letterhead until 1918. And this is due to health reasons. I believe that he lost most of his sight when it was unable to work. Rowland, in his own AIA filings, stipulates that he and Wilby were responsible for the Hill Auditorium design and the Hatcher Library design. But as I said, Wilby's initials don't appear on the plans. And moreover, Wilby was primarily responsible for certain features of buildings. And he was also much more involved in the industrial architecture than Rowland was. And the thing that Wilby was most proud of after his career ended was his design of the windows in Albert Kahn's industrial buildings. That is, Wilby came up with the idea of taking the basic reinforced concrete framework and filling the entire space between the piers with glass, save for a short bit of bricks to hold up the windows at the bottom of the bay. And that was the thing that Wilby often pointed to as being his greatest accomplishment. And it was a significant accomplishment because Wilby worked with Julius Kahn and the Truss Concrete Steel Company to develop a new kind of sash that would fill the entire area, be in one piece, was made entirely of steel, and had a window within it that could be opened. And it revolutionized the daylighting of factories. So my feeling is that Wilby was involved in much different things than Rowland, and that was why it was so essential for Kahn to rehire Rowland and bring him back to the firm when Amadeo Leon left and went to Smith, Hinchman and Grills in 1915. Is that a good answer?
Yeah,
You seem unconvinced.
well, I think that there were a lot of people in Kahn's office during that period of time in the teens, and I think they all influenced one another. C. Albert Crane worked in the Kahn office for a while.
Right.
And had input and certainly sparked the creativity and perhaps competition
Mm-hmm.
that drives us all, in firms like this. So I guess I wonder how much influence you think Albert Kahn had on Bert Rowland in some of the detailing and design work that he did.
Albert Kahn's influence was very general. He was very busy running a company of over 300 employees, and he was very involved in marketing and selling his company to potential customers. That's why he paid Wilby and Rowland so much money, because they were responsible for designing these buildings, not Albert Kahn. If Kahn was interested in designing buildings, he wouldn't have built a large empire of designers and engineers and salespeople and superintendents and all that. He was very good at delegating work, which is why he succeeded in building a very successful and very rapidly growing business. However, Kahn he had some very distinct views about buildings at certain points. As I mentioned, after the First World War, Kahn became disenchanted with modern architecture. He felt that it would show its age, which is generally true of most things that have a style to them, that no sooner are they popular than they go out of style and people become disinterested in having them. and that's the way Kahn felt about modern architecture. He thought that it would lose its appeal. He didn't have any way of foreseeing that the things that Rowland would design would become so timeless in their appearance. So you can hardly really blame him for having that sense. But he insisted that his designers go back to using Greek and Roman classical features on their buildings. And that's why the First National Bank building, which is right here, and the General Motors building have classical columns on them, which Rowland did his best to tone down by making them smooth instead of fluted in the case of the General Motors building. And in the case of the First National Bank building, he used columns that he copied from Italian sources that were Greek rather than Roman. But that was Kahn's influence. It was very general, not specific. One thing I'll mention too is that Rowland was instrumental in starting and running both the Detroit Architecture Club and the later Thumbtack Club. And he did that for the chief purpose of being able to inculcate good design principles in all of Detroit's architectural designers. C. Howard Crane was not a member of that club, but many of the people in Kahn's office who later designed the Fisher Building and other Kahn buildings were, like Nathaniel French, for example. So I wouldn't say that Crane was really in the central river of creative designers in Detroit, but many other people who worked for Kahn were and later became very influential, including Amadeo Leon, who left Kahn's office, went to, he was the designer of the Detroit Athletic Club. Kahn hired him specifically to do that design because Rowland had left and gone to Malcolmson and Higginbotham. When Leon left Kahn's office, that's when Kahn approached Rowland and hired him back to be Kahn's head designer, along with Wilby. But Leon at Smith, Hinchman & Grills became a very influential designer and ultimately became president of the company a number of years later. So you could say that it's Kahn's office or Kahn's influence, or you could say that it's Rowland's influence. It's really a matter of just the way you look at it. Yes, sir?
Yeah, you touched on the Fisher Building a moment ago.
Uh-huh.
Who actually is the head designer? Would Albert Kahn have been?
No. He was not a designer. He was not a head designer. He was the president of a large company. It would have been French for the most part, and a number of other people who worked under, all of which worked under Rowland when he was there, and were trained by him in design. More questions? Yes, sir.
Okay, you cite Albert Kahn's organization with 300 drafts or 300 employees working. Was there a different dynamic when Rowland was working for smaller firms?
In terms of design or in terms of the
His influence, or does he stand out more in one versus the other?
Well, the thing about Rowland is that he, almost from day one when he arrived in Detroit, he worked for large firms. He worked for George Mason, which I believe was the largest firm at the time. Then he worked for Malcolmson and Higginbotham, which was a large firm, not the largest. He worked for Kahn most of through the teens, which was the largest firm in the city. And he worked for Smith, Hinchman & Grills, which then, at the time Rowland worked for them, had become the largest firm in the city. It was only after the Depression started, the stock market collapsed in '29. By the end of 1930, most architecture firms had become a minuscule fraction of the number of people that they had hired. I think by 1933, Smith, Hinchman & Grills had slimmed down from over 300 people to just the 4 partners and 2 secretaries. So at that point, Rowland became a partner with Gus Odell in a very small firm. they actually got some significant assignments at that point. But it's hard to know really how Rowland, what Rowland's life would have been if there hadn't been a 10-year-long depression. I don't know. I don't know that anybody can really speculate. The only time after that he worked for a large company is he worked for Giffords during the run-up to World War II, and during World War II he worked for them in one of their offices that designed entire naval bases and was a significant contributor to that effort. Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about the latter stages of Ford's career? Predominantly the church, I think it's Christ Church, you have featured at the bottom of the slide.
Kirk in the Hills.
Kirk of the Hills,
In Bloomfield Hills, yes.
very different style than what we see in the earlier years.
Well, you're absolutely right, and that's not because of Rowland's choice, but because that was the work that Rowland could get. The Kirk in the Hills was begun in 1935 when the person who was going to pay for Kirk in the Hills hired Rowland to do sketches. Now, looking through the sketches that Rowland did for the church, he made some sketches of what would have been a modern church. It just didn't get the approval of the fellow who was paying for the church. He was a Gothicist and insisted on a Gothic church. That was his dream. He wanted to build a Gothic church. And so he was paying the bill. That's what he got. And that was the work that Rowland could get at the time. If there hadn't been a depression, he probably still would have been working for Smith, Hinchman, and Grills and designing modern buildings. But Rowland heavily criticizes Gothic architecture in a number of his writings. He urges architects not to use it as a basis for design for modern buildings. And even when he designed the Jefferson Avenue Presbyterian Church, he designed it in an English style, which does not utilize the Gothic architectural elements that you think of or see in the Kirk in the Hills Church. So it was he pushed things as far to his way of thinking as a modernist as he could, without being disingenuous or being untruthful to his own design standards. Yes, ma'am. Well, it's not essentially a copy, but it began as a copy of I believe, a Scottish cathedral. But the only part of it that's really a copy is this part of it right here. The rest of the church is really a free design that Rowland came up with, staying within the design constrictions that the building's owner placed upon him. But there's a number of things, and I don't know if I can really get into it in detail here, but just to give you a sense of maybe what you might want to look into. The tower of the church is extremely unique, and if you look at it from above, you'll see that it conforms to the same exact plan form as the north tower of the Guardian building. It was the rotated squares that I was showing you that there's a root 2 figure. So Rowland brought those same design principles to bear no matter what he worked on. The fact that the exterior skin of the building is Gothic was something that was beyond his control, but he still employed the same underlying principles that go all the way back to the Greeks. Yes?
Is there any structural integrity to using the root 2 or root 3 system, or is it aesthetic, purely aesthetic?
You know, that's a very good question, and one I really haven't considered. I think that one way to think about that is that the reason that the Greeks initiated that system is because they didn't have any way of conveying a standard measure. So if they wrote on a plan 3 feet, we all know what that means. It means nothing really specifically. But you can specify certain interrelationships by using geometry. And so the architects of that era could take a string and a rock, and they could design a square, they could design a rectangle, but ultimately all those figures would be dynamically symmetrical because they would be either a square, a root 2, root 3, root 4, root 5 rectangle, because that was the only place you could get to if you're using basically a compass. So it started out as a method of creating a structural design, so that in order to have a building remain standing, you had to have some kind of a plan that was structural in nature, and the only way to define what that plan was going to be was through a compass and a string, kind of a design, kind of a plan. So it's my belief that the use of dynamic symmetry that you see, say for example in the Parthenon, was not fundamentally for structural reasons, but because over a period of time, the use of that method of defining geometry evolved from structural to visual and then to decorative. So it's something that also appears not just in architecture, but all Greek pottery was designed using the same system. Square, root 2, root 3, all dynamically symmetrical, which is why Greek pottery is to this day recognized as being the most beautifully designed pottery ever seen.
Well, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much for having me.